Good morning again to everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's meeting, today's webinar, that is organized by the Mediterranean Biodiversity Protection Community of the Interreg Mediterranean Program. My name is Elodie Nunes. I am one of the partners of this project from the CPMR, Inter-Mediterranean Commission. We are a network of regions throughout Europe and throughout the Mediterranean, and so we're basically here in the project to link all content with public administrations. So today we're meeting for the works of our working group 2, mostly to talk about what can we do from a policy to action regarding environmental contracts. And so we're working on the idea on the approach of a multi-stakeholders and multi-level governance tool for an effective governance of Mediterranean wetlands and marine protected areas. So before we start, I would just like to do some housekeeping, as we say. So ask you, please, if you're not talking, to mute yourself and to turn off your camera. We will, I think we will take a picture after, maybe Luca, if we haven't done so, once everyone has joined. So we will turn our cameras back at the end of the meeting. Of course, if you have questions, you're welcome to ask them in the chat. But there is a specific dedicated session within our meeting where you will be able to take the floor and to comment or ask questions on what's been said before. So just be a bit patient and your turn will come. So as I said earlier today, we're meeting for a second working group of the Biodiversity Protection Community on the sustainable use of natural resources. Mainly, the agenda will consist of the presentation of 2 projects that are actually, one is the follow-up of the other. So the WETNET and the TUNE UP projects that are dealing with environmental contracts regarding wetlands and marine protected areas. Then we will have an expert giving us feedback on what's been presented by the project. And then you will have the opportunity, as I said, to give also your feedback on the project's presentation. So it's really important that you bring your visions to the table, because the idea really is to understand how we can fine-tune the project's results, and then how we can make sure that once the projects are over, for example, you can also use the tools they have developed for your own work and for your own organizations. So concretely speaking, for those of you who are not too acquainted with the community, the Mediterranean Biodiversity Protection Community, or MBPC, as we like to call it, is the second phase of the Panacea Project. So Panacea, you might have known that project in the previous years, which is basically the umbrella project encompassing more thematic projects on the themes of biodiversity protection in the Mediterranean. So the role of the community is to make sure that the results of those thematic projects are actually linked to policymaking in the good way, so that the territorial realities actually are represented at policy level, and with the idea that we're not just making policies with no link to the real reality. Sorry. So the main thematic focus of MBPC, of the Mediterranean Biodiversity Protection Community, includes several areas such as coastal and marine management, biodiversity monitoring, sustainable use of natural resources, which is our working group today, but also the management of protected areas, climate change, obviously, governance, cooperation, and scientific and innovative technologies. It's composed of 10 already finalized projects and 5 ongoing ones. Leading to the working groups Or maybe, no, sorry, I think I skipped a slide. Yes, if you can move to the following slide, sorry. Yes, so these are the main outputs so far that have been developed within the community. So they are built with the contributions of all thematic projects. And more specifically, we have a declaration on an ecosystem-based approach that was drafted by MBPC, Panacea/MBPC, and that you can still sign. It's available online. And basically, it's a sort of non-binding commitment to make sure that in your works and in your activities, you're considering the recommendations that are listed in the declaration. So that's one of the main policy outputs that have been developed, that have been also presented to European institutions, and so that we are still supporting in the framework of our respective organizations too. And secondly, you also have the Mediterranean Biodiversity Protection Knowledge Platform this time, which is a platform gathering all information or input from the projects in an integrated way, and to give you access to what has been done, and that you can consult freely on the website. So maybe later, yeah, I will put the links in the chat so you can go check if you haven't yet. And if you already have, I encourage you to keep promoting it. Next slide, please. Yes, so that leads me to talk again about the project that I mentioned earlier. So you see that there are quite a good number of projects in the community. Today we will talk about TUNE UP, and you see on the right column that the ones in bold are the ones going on right now, and the other ones are over. And WETNET, so was the ancestor project, I would say, of the TUNE UP project. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this slide is just a slide to give you a bit more information beyond the knowledge platform and beyond the policy declaration. There are also lots of other inputs that you can check on our website. There are several papers, fact sheets that are referring to the works of the thematic projects. We've, of course, we've organized already some webinars, other policy events with different kinds of stakeholders in the Mediterranean. And so this is all available on our website. Thank you, Jordi, for mentioning it in the chat. More specifically, regarding Working Group 2, so we have developed a technical paper, which topic you can see on the screen. So regarding participatory approaches towards the co-management of natural resources in coastal and marine areas. Well, I won't enter into too many details because it's also available for you to read. So I will move forward. Jordi, yes. And to give you also an idea of what kind of case studies are showcased in the paper, you can see here the list of projects on which it has based its input. So each project has its specific angle, so to say. So where some have dealt with small-scale fisheries, for example, some others with wetlands or the blue economy in a more general way. It linked to the management of marine protected areas, and so on and so forth. So it's quite integrated. It also gives some, let's say, good practices from administrations that have put in place such practices, such integrated approaches or ecosystemic based approaches. So it's really useful to have a look at it as well. And lastly, yes, to go back to the objective of today's meeting, therefore, so we will have a presentation of the key outputs regarding the use of environmental contracts. For this, we will have the WETNET/TUNE UP project with us to do so. And we'll have the review of these outputs by our experts and by you participants in the chat or lively. If you want to take the floor, you're free also to do so when we get to the dedicated session. And so the broad idea is, of course, to consolidate those results, those tools with your inputs, so that we can make better use of them in the future. And with this, I leave you with our with Luca, maybe, who is our support, or with Giancarlo, who is
Yes, thanks, Elodie.
from the project. And I wish you a good meeting. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Elodie. Good morning. I'm Luca Santarossa, consultant for the CPMR. Someone maybe has opened the mic. I'm supporting CPMR in the management of this working group number 2, and I'm, let's say, the coordinator of this series of webinars. No, because as you understood, this is the third webinar where we present best practices, no, already accomplished, already tested, no, by the projects that we are dealing with, as you saw in the list. So today we are talking about environmental contracts that the project WETNET and then TUNE UP developed and implemented in some pilot areas. And Giancarlo Gusmaroli is the, let's say, the main coordinator now of this process towards these two projects. So he will present us the general approach and the specific tool of the environmental contract, while Brian Shipman will make a sort of peer review, but in the view of proposing further potential follow-ups and improvements, let's say, of this approach and this tool. And of course, we wait from you in the last part of today's webinar further suggestions. By next Monday, you will receive a short report of the webinar and also the discussion. So you will have the main, let's say, key features and that has risen today. So you will have let's say, a final output. No, I said a report, but very short, in order to keep the main results of today's webinar. And then at the end of this webinar, I will announce you the next webinar in early 2022. But this is let's say the last slide. So the floor to Giancarlo Gusmaroli. Thanks for being with us, and you can say a few words introducing yourself, and then you have maximum 30 minutes for your presentation. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Luca. Just audio check. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we hear you very well.
Perfect. So first of all, good morning, everybody. And I would like to thank you on behalf of the two partnership of both WETNET and TUNE UP projects. We are very happy to be here, to have this opportunity to share our experience. I've been personally the scientific coordinator of the WETNET project on behalf of the Italian Center for River Restoration, that was the advisory partner of the project. And I'm working in TUNE UP project as an expert in the steering committee on behalf of the MEDSEA Foundation, Mediterranean Sea Foundation, based in Sardinia, Italy. The two projects are connected each other. We can say that the WETNET has opened the window, and now TUNE UP is flowing through, capitalizing the experience of WETNET. And so my presentation will not focus on the experience of the two projects, but on the output, the main findings we have experienced in this 5, almost 6 years of exercise in the Mediterranean. So you already know the topic. The topic is, let's say, governance of water bodies in the Mediterranean, in which biodiversity is an high value. And so typically these water bodies are protected at any level, local, regional, national, or international. And we have tried to implement in such a challenging place a voluntary based governance tool able to put together the different stakes that are in place in that corner of the Mediterranean, and clearly the stakeholders that are holding these stakes, with the final purpose of defining a common strategy, an action plan, able to achieve the sustainable management of those water bodies. Now I start sharing my screen. 1 second. So just let me know if it works so that I can just think talking.
Yes, it works. May put it in the demo.
Okay, perfect.
Demo function.
Full screen, yes.
Full screen, yes.
Okay. So in general, we are dealing with the coastal wetlands in the Ramsar definition meanings that include, as you might know, rivers, lake, lagoons, shallow waters, even marine shallow waters. So a broad array of wetlands that are that are placed at the border of the Mediterranean. This is the core area of interest of our project. The first slide is the main reference you can use for go deeper in what I will be presenting today, briefly, obviously, because of the time constraints. So both the projects have developed a methodology, a document in which the approach we have tested has been described together with an analysis of how the pilot experience have been done, strengths and weaknesses and lesson learned. So on the left you see the WETNET deliverable. On the right you see the TUNE UP deliverable. In WETNET we deal in general with terrestrial wetlands. In TUNE UP we move to marine protected areas. So we are transferring actually the methodology to the sea. And the first document has been edited by the Italian Center for River Restoration. The second document has been edited by University of Roma 3. So let's start from something that is known, but it is important to be always to keep always in our mind. Our wetlands are suffering. The health of our wetlands at the Mediterranean scale, at European scale, actually, is not so desirable. This is a conservation status of species by ecosystems at a European scale, in which you can see that wetlands are facing a very bad condition. More of half of European wetlands are in unfavorable state. And in terms of habitats, that is the other side of biodiversity, you see the situation is even worse. So biodiversity in European and Mediterranean wetlands is not good. If we look at connectivity, we can see that here in the Mediterranean, wetlands are suffering the worst degree of connectivity, with a trend that is going worse and worse. We have lost in the last 10 years the 4% of connectivity at European level, at in the continental region, but in the Mediterranean region the trend is even worse. The 14% of connectivity has been lost, and we know that if biodiversity at place scale is bad and connectivity is low, we are on the way for a disaster, for an environmental disaster, an ecological disaster. At the same time, we know that wetlands are in core of our economies and of local development of the places in which they are, because of the many ecosystem services they have been providing since centuries, and they are providing even nowadays. And behind each of these services, of this interest that the human community have on wetlands, there is, or let's say there are different group of interest. So it's not just a matter of putting together the state and the pressure of the wetland, but is a challenge of putting together the people that live behind what we call ecosystem services, that from a certain point of view are a pressure for the biodiversity conservation of wetland. So it's clear that if we deal with the complexity of human beings, of local communities, what we should desire is to work like this. If the governance was a boat, we would be expected to paddle all together in the same direction. And this will allow us to manage properly our natural capital, our wetland, our landscape in general. But unfortunately, from a governance point of view, what often happens is this, that each single stakeholder feels to be alone. He's not able to let's say, to deliver, to achieve its scope, because the community is not working at the same page. Each one is looking at him like this, like like an administration that is just giving or not an authorization, or like a local committee that is against the proposal of this stakeholder. And the situation can be even worse when we actually have stakeholders that are acting, but not in a coordinated way. So this is not a situation of non-action. This is a situation of action in which governance basically is scattered, is each one with its own rules, each one with its own objectives and commitment. In order to try to give an answer to this challenge, starting from the early 80s in France, the wetland contract has been conceived and started as an experience. This is the French document that introduced for the first time in Europe the tool of the river contract. At that time, river were the main concern, but nowadays we are talking, as I told you, about water bodies in general, wetlands in general. And so the tool of the wetland contract is not something new. It's something we are experiencing in Europe since 40 years, 40 years. This is the current situation, more or less current situation in France, in which you see the number of environmental contracts, or contrats de milieu in French, that are that have been implemented or are achieved or ongoing in France. French. This is the situation in Belgium, in which basically each river basin of the Wallonian region has a contract. And this is the situation in Italy a few years ago. This is the last official census of a river contract, a wetland contract in Italy. So it's not updated, but I can tell you, because I am involved in this activity in Italy, that the situation nowadays is we have more than 250 contracts ongoing in Italy at different stages. So just to say that this tool, even beyond the Mediterranean borders, is well tested. Our challenge was to check whether this approach, this governance approach, could fit with the Mediterranean region and with its peculiar challenges in terms of environment, of society, of economy, and of governance, of course. So let's try to enter a bit more into the detail of what this environmental contract is. This diagram try to represent what I call the P's of governance. So typically the decision makers start from the acknowledgement of problems, decision-making problems, so negative or positive interpretation, and he start delivering policies that then take the form of plans and then programs and then projects that eventually try to affect the initial problems. And at each level, there is more or less engagement of the public, of the general public, and of stakeholders, of course. So the wetland contract work at this stage is an action plan, is a program. So it doesn't take the place of any existing plan. It is not a project, so it is not the table in which you prepare the executive design of anything. This is the, let's say, the middle point between the plan and the project. I used to call the contract like a lubrificant, something that makes strategies able to be actions. And so allocate economical resources and the human resources in hopefully in the right place, in the right moment, in order to achieve the objective that policies and plans have previously defined. And clearly the contract, even the contract, is a tool that with the NIG value and a NIG component of public engagement, of public participation. If we want to enter a bit more in which are the main features of this contract, of this governance tool, considering that it is consistent with all the main directives that that build the regulatory framework for managing wetland on the Mediterranean scale, its peculiarities can be summarized in these 4 key words. The contract has an entrance, an input, starting point that is voluntary, like all contracts. So no one is forced, is obliged to start a contract. Any stakeholder can freely decide to join or not the governance process. But at the same time, it is inclusive. That is, no one is out since the beginning. So there is room for any stakeholder, public or private, that want to contribute to this voluntary-based governance process. You might say that a voluntary tool is weak because if it is not mandatory, clearly you are not sure to be able to work with the appropriate stakeholder, with the relevant stakeholder. But at the same time, looking at the other side of the coin, a voluntary-based process is very strong, because when you decide to do something because you believe, you feel that this is a chance, this is something useful, your motivation is high. So it doesn't matter how many stakeholders are on board, but what you know is that the one you are working with are pushed by a motivation. And so you can start the governance process with a strong team, let's say. Maybe not comprehensive, not able to solve, to tackle all the challenges your wetland have, but you have a good team to start the work. And then it's up to you to demonstrate that with that team, you can achieve some even partial outcomes, and demonstrate to other stakeholders that might be interesting to them to join on board even later. The output, the exit of the contract is that at least the final result has to be more collaboration, more cooperation among stakeholders. Because even if the contract is weak, what I mean is, even if you are not able to contractualize strong decisions, what you have done has been working together. And when you work together in an effective way, you learn governance. And so starting from that experience, the future of governance in that wetland, in that corner of the Mediterranean, is expected to be stronger, more effective. At the same time, more ambitious, but is within the definition of each contract, is obligations trigger. When you sign a contract, it's clear that you are assuming some commitment, and this commitment is not just like shaking your hands with your friend. It's something with legal value. So whatever you decide to contractualize for the management of that wetland, that decision is binding, is stronger than any other voluntary-based decision-making process. This means that within the contract, you share not only the action plan, but you share the rules of the game. So you decide what signing means, for instance. What if? What I have to do, which is my role, my responsibility, and what happens if I don't comply with my commitment. The stakeholders that join on board of the contract decide their own rules, obviously always being consistent with the legal framework of your country, of your region, of your wetland, clearly. But within this regulatory framework, you decide how much strong is your contract. And this is true for any contract. When you buy a car, when you buy a home, you have some general rules that have to be set because of the law, but other rules that are to be decided between the parts, between the signing parts. So this flexibility.
I beg your pardon, Giancarlo, because you asked me to inform you about the time passing. You have still 8 minutes for your presentation.
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect. I go faster. So, but I'm now focusing on the main features of this tool. So it's
your
flexible.
Presentation disappeared.
My presentation disappeared. So 1 second. 1 second. Let's see.
You stopped the sharing of the screen.
Okay, now it should be
yeah,
again.
Now we see it.
Okay, so flexible flexible tool in order to adapt to the place-based conditions, environmental, economical, and social. So I'm going to give you some more recommendation coming from our experience, not a recipe book. You cannot make any copy and paste from our experience because each governance process has its own soul, its own challenges, its own background. So what you have to do is more a tailor, and the contract, this governance tool, has to be designed with a tailor-made approach. Let me go through this array of recommendation to start. So remember, you need at least 3 ingredients. They are really important up to our experience. You need a wetland. It might seem obvious, but it is not. You need a wetland with a decision-making problem. You cannot start such a governance tool that is very effort demanding if you don't have a problem to work with. So don't implement a contract just because it is fashioning, but do it only if you need it. And you need a community. This might be obvious again, but it is not, because you need a community interested and willing to share knowledge and share expectations. If the community is divided, if people is there, if stakeholders are there, not willing to work each other, not willing to start the process, you have to invest in this. You have to train them before starting the governance process. Otherwise, you will have ghosts attending your your meetings, your governance process. You need an aware community. And then you need institutions in terms of political will, because whatever is the partnership, whoever are the stakeholders, you are deciding about a common good. So the role of the institution is to be equal, to take decision within this voluntary based tool with the stakeholders that are joining the governance process, that are win-win for each of the interests that are on the table, even those that are not represented by the stakeholders attending the governance process. So you need these three ingredients to start. Then you need this bottom-up process. You have to start from the problems. I already told this issue. The community has to be aware of which the problems are, and the public administration has to be aware that the community is aware of this. So you need a general awareness starting from the real problem affecting your wetland. Then you have to work for building a common vision. This is a joke, a game. The one in the picture is an optical game. Some of you can see a young girl, some other an old woman. Doesn't matter. This is normal because each one of us, each stakeholder has its common view, its own tools for perceiving reality. What you have to do before sharing any action plan is to have a common goal, a common vision, a common strategy, a common set of objectives. So this is something that you have to design in your process. You cannot decide what to do if the vision, the language, even the language is not the same amongst stakeholders. Then you have to consider that participation is not just a matter of engaging people, engaging the public, is before of any other action is a matter of activating the internal participation within any organization that is joining the governance process, and external participation in terms of interinstitutional dialogue. Before going to the public, before going to the private sector, asking them to join on board and share everything, you have to demonstrate that your organization, the public organization you represent, and other private are open, are able to dialogue internally. Otherwise, participation starts in a weak way. Then remember, any governance process is a decision-making process. And looking at the etymology of the word deciding, remember that deciding is always choosing among alternatives, different possibilities. So any alternative, any option is welcome in the governance process. The main scope of the governance process is to have on the table the alternatives that might be brought by any of the stakeholders engaged in the process. Then you decide, but you cannot build the contract only on one option that has to be shared. Then, last but not least, this is keywords of the contract. The main purpose, the main, let's say, outcome you should achieve with this governance exercise is not sharing decision. So your main scope is not the action plan, because the action plan is something temporary. You know, today you can have an action plan. In 2 years, you might have the need of changing your action plan. So what is most important to achieve is to share the way of making decisions. Let's say the rule of the game, how to engage stakeholder, how to work together. This is the core mission of the contract governance. If you are able to achieve this, you will be able in the future to adapt any decision to the current constraints, challenges, rules, disaster, climate change, or whatever. I have 4 slides here that are very technical. I'm not going to go into detail. I just want to show you that we have developed some, let's say, organizational and designing tool for building your contract. Before starting the contract, you have to design your process. So recommendation in the two documents I have shown you at the beginning. But as you can see, the one of you that are confident with stakeholder engagement and the stakeholder engagement design are aware of the importance of analyzing the stakeholders and being aware of which are the main features of your community and which is the relevance of your stakeholder in accord with in relation with the themes you are going to discuss. So this diagram is a typical relevance matrix analysis of the stakeholder analysis. And what I would like to point out here is that the more influenceful and powerful and the more interest has a stakeholder, the more energy you have to put in managing this stakeholder in the process. But don't forget the ones with low interest and low power and low influence, because governance is a pedagogic process. The stakeholder is not always the same all along the governance process. They might start with a low interest, a low influence and a low power, but because of your governance process, their interest, their influence, and their power might grow, and so they can change into different, let's say, engagement levels. So be aware, don't use any of the classification that are provided when designing a stakeholder process. Don't put label to your stakeholder that are static for forever. Be open, be adaptive, even in your engagement process. I will let you this table to be analyzed, not now, but as you can see, you design the level of inclusion, of engagement, according even to the stakeholder expectations. It's not because this stakeholder is relevant that you have to engage him, but you have to consider their willingness, their how much prone they are to be engaged, and according to this, design different level of engagement, even for each stakeholder or of group of stakeholders. Look, I think I have 1 minute.
See, yeah, exactly. The time is over. Let's say 2 minutes to go to the end to the presentation. Thanks. In any case, in the report we will spread out. There will be also the slides that are pretty self-explanatory.
Exactly. And the last one is about monitoring. So don't forget to establish since the very beginning of the process a monitoring approach that should include at least this level of let's say a checklist dealing with this objective of the governance process. There are a lot of tools to develop monitoring process. Brian is an expert in this, and I'm sure he will share with us some talks about the importance of monitoring governance processes. Don't forget, anyway, that this contract is very pragmatic. So the action plan, I told you, is not the only scope of the governance, but in any case is the final output you have to achieve. Otherwise, you are not contractualizing something operational, but just a general agreement. So the action plan should be very clear in terms of responsibility, timing, resources. So the day after the signature of the contract, you have to be able to start implementing in order, you might know this diagram, in order to attract different funding opportunities at local, regional, national, European, or even international level. So the contract basically is a passport for dealing with a lot of economical opportunities. So that's all from my side. I hope I've been able to deliver some stimulating aspect of the experience we have done. And clearly I'm here and open for any discussion, suggestion, question, or whatever you feel useful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giancarlo. As usual, you put a lot of interesting points in this wide topic of governance. And it's a matter of fact that we exploit your projects several times in our webinars and public events. So it is not the first time we ask you to spread what you developed, now starting from a methodology in specific applications, let's say. And I see on the chat already some questions, but I propose to move to our nice guest peer that accepted to act as a peer reviewer, Brian Shipman. He's working also for PAPRAC, for the Priority Action Plan Regional Activity Center of the UNEP Mediterranean Action Plan. But he can introduce himself, and we asked him not to analyze the experience of WETNET and TUNE UP, and specifically on the approach and on the environmental contract, asking him some suggestions for improvement in future activities. Brian, the floor is yours. Jordi will manage your PowerPoint.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. From here on the Atlantic coast, I think I'm probably the exception to everyone else in the meeting. Yeah, I thought I'd preface my comments with a little bit of background about myself, because it might help you understand more of the points I'm making. In the introduction to the TUNE UP publication, there's an interesting comparison of the civil law system of continental Europe, under which that contract system was developed, and the common law tradition of Anglo-Saxon countries, primarily the UK. And the relevance to myself is that I'm from that Anglo-Saxon tradition, in which we haven't used formal codified contracts in this arena. We've preferred to use different terminology. We've preferred forums, partnerships, anything but a formal codified contract. And what we do is we rely on trust between the partners, the stakeholders, or more often mutual distrust of each other. Politics plays a big part, and peer pressure, rather than that formal document. And whilst I help pioneer this approach in the UK from the late 1980s and 90s, I've closely followed with a great deal of interest and sometimes participation the contract experience in France since the 1990s, particularly the Contrat de Bail, which was developed around that time. And what I'd say about these two systems, the Anglo-Saxon and the continental models, is that they both have their strengths, but the fundamental difference between the two traditions are important and are reflected in my comments below. And the second thing about me is I'm not a natural scientist, and I'm probably an exception to the rule again in this meeting. I'm trained originally as a spatial planner, and my approach to the environment came primarily from a community regeneration perspective in some of the poorest areas of the UK, where environment was seen as a tool in improving community health, not as an end in itself. And what I experienced during those times was that participation, exercise, community engagement, all these things can be a very tough and a very bruising experience. And finally, as Luke has mentioned, I've been my latest reincarnation working for over 10 years for what we call PAPRAC on the Mediterranean Action Plan in Split in Croatia, focused on ICZM, Integrated Coastal Zone Management, and marine spatial planning, but also more recently some work on the governance of coastal wetlands. So if I could skip now to the first slide, please. And I've been asked to look at, in this order, firstly looking at the WETNET TUNE UP approach, and firstly the main strengths. And it was welcoming to me to see that the work is based on the subsidiarity principle, which is enshrined in the Treaty of the European Union, which, as you should know, states that decisions should be taken as closely as possible to the citizen. And for me, this is absolutely fundamental. In Europe, this is the glue linking the citizen to government and should underpin all our work. So it's good to see that that was recognised. Secondly, was also really interesting to see the enormous heterogeneity of the pilot sites. And I always feel that if you've got a very different pilot sites, you get a much richer experience and a richer feedback, not only because of their marine resources, but also their institutional and cultural context. And so you've got the real test of applying local specificity to a broad methodology. And thirdly is the critical overview of MPAs in the Mediterranean. And I found a very useful and critical overview of the nature and status of MPAs in the Mediterranean, along with a recognition of the scale of the challenge, notably that particular challenge to reach the 30% coverage. And combined with that, the lack of data and knowledge and the geographical imbalance in terms of location and scale, which is both, for me, both a strength and a potential weakness of the approach. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Still staying on strengths. Again, a recognition, something we found looking at wetlands, coastal wetlands in the Mediterranean. There is no single unified management model, and that is well recognized. And my own recent experience in the development of governance methodology for Mediterranean wetlands highlighted that the governance of individual sites can range from real extremes, from highly centralized top-down model determined in the national or regional capital and everything is dictated from there, all the way through to the opposite end of the spectrum, where you've got bottom-up, locally driven models. And sometimes those can change over time as the politics of the country changes. And the contract approach is somewhere between that top-down and bottom-up. I really enjoyed the participatory methods discussed and the fact that it was seen as fundamental to overcome and settle real territorial conflicts. And Giancarlo has already referred to that ladder of participation at the end of his talk there, ranging from that simple informing right through to full-scale community engagement and control. An important recognition, where am I? I'm up to speed. Yes, if I could go on to the, no, sorry, can stay on the previous slide, sorry. Yeah, sorry, finally there, territorial area.
You have
there was
12 minutes, Brian.
Okay, there was an important recognition of the territorial area to be considered by any contract at its preparatory stage, notably the wider influence area around the MPA and the upstream dynamics and target areas that need to incorporate social and economic network systems on a wider basis. However, whilst this was recognised in the discussion of the process, it's not clear if this was followed through into the pilot areas later described. So moving on to the next slide, please. In terms of areas for improvement, I always find this at the end of projects, people want to write everything about everything. And I did feel that there was an overemphasis on the legislative context, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Water Framework Directive, etc., and the principle and history of contracts. And I felt that to some extent that clouded the message. And I think it's important that in final documents, stuff like that can go in an appendix. We should, most of the readers should be fairly well aware, particularly of the legislative contract. So a little bit more focus in the report writing, with focus on the methodology, its outputs and the lessons. And again, something I usually pick up, everyone feels they have to write a bit of the report, and so you end up with a difference in style and again some repetition. So again, editing into a single cohesive document rather than a series of individual papers. But perhaps my biggest concern, what I missed, and what I always tend to miss in these things, is some of the key practical dimensions of this work are absent. And for the reader who might be interested in replicating and testing this methodology, there was a notable lack of discussion of the practical real world issues involved in the delivery of these local contracts and that stakeholder engagement. You know, how much skill, what skills are required, what resources, what capacity have the people got who are actually driving this? Who's doing it? You know, I want to know the personal stories and critical matters that actually can make or break a contract discussion, where the delivery team's office is and who's seen to be behind that. Is it in the regional capital or in a small building within the pilot area itself? And whilst these may seem trivial, they can have major practical and political implications. For example, whether or not the project team is regarded as that really important, to use an English phrase, honest broker with their local interests at heart, or is it yet another guy from the regional administration coming to tell them what to do? So I'd like to hear those first-hand stories, what it's like on the front line, because at the heart of this is a human and not just a technocratic process. So what worked and what didn't? And again, on this exit strategies, there's a lot of talk about, yes, we've signed the contract and we've got an action plan. But for me, there weren't the adequate long-term exit strategies and analysis of post-project risks, because once you take the project away, then it's on its own. What have you done to really ensure that this process and its benefits will be embedded and delivered over a longer period? And because for me, this is really important, because what I found in my own work is short-term projects, usually funded by the EU or another body, run the risk of raising false expectations in the target community and may actually set back the potential for collaborative working when everything appears to when the proponents walk away from it. And really, we should be talking 25 to 30 year timescales. And related to that point, if I can move on to the next slide, governance is not a project. And this is something I talk about a lot. There's an inherent difference between the timescale of a typical European project and the long-term requirement of a contract. That's a fundamental issue, and what I call the tyranny of the project cycle. Changing tack slightly here, the next point, MPAs or coastal zones. I was interested when I looked closely at the pilots MPAs. They're not all strictly marine. Most of them include some freshwater and terrestrial habitats. And this raises a question for me, which is not really addressed in the documentation. Is a plan specific and contract specifically for the marine protected area the most appropriate? Or would an ICZM plan, for example, under the ICZM protocol for the Mediterranean, be more effective and appropriate? Because the latter, the ICZM plan, provides a ready-made framework for extending into that boundary of influence you talked about, to correspond with the ecosystem boundary and extend out to the territorial limits of the sea, which may be more appropriate in these coastal areas. So it's perhaps a very basic question, but what is the most appropriate plan vehicle and contract vehicle? And finally, with the MedWet, I put a question mark next to ecosystem-based approach. I'm not sure for me, I didn't see the report fully articulating the link to the ecosystem-based approach, and it tends to retreat to within those designated area boundaries of the MPA, rather than nesting within a wider river basin or coastal approach. And one particular example I commend is the work carried out, particularly through the Global Water Partnership, on the Dreen River Basin approach, which includes 6 countries working together to tackle the whole river basin, of which the coastal and marine area is one component. So that's the WETNET TUNE approach. Moving on to the river wetland contracts, some repetition here, so I'll hurry through this. Key strength, it does focus on a stakeholder engagement. The range of the tools for their engagements welcome. I particularly was interested in the territorial laboratories, which had a very interesting range of participation and scenario techniques. The binding contracts has a numerous advantages over the less formalized partnership approach from my own Anglo-Saxon tradition. It does at least give you a foundation document to work on. Pursuing equity. And also the recommendations did provide some useful guidance to overcome what are inevitable imbalance in the power and resources between many stakeholders. Giancarlo referred to this in his talk, and provide some useful techniques to engage those who may lack the necessary organization, the language, or the resources. And of course, they're pursuing synergy, and it is recognized that this is more than a paper-based interinstitutional agreement, simply sharing some government objectives, but it's something wider than that, encompassing wider environmental and socio-economic interest. So it is seen as part of a continuous process of governance. But in terms of areas for improvement, if I can switch to the next slide, yeah. Again, a phrase I'd like, if you take away one phrase from this, is seek outcomes, not just outputs. The ultimate objective of any effort to achieve sustainability must be to achieve behaviour in the long term, not just agree a set of actions in the short to medium term. So what you're doing, and this is what we were trying to do in the wetlands, is move from a situation in which you're always having to push the agenda from an external point of view to get everybody to keep working together, to keep thinking about the long-term objectives, to one in which they do it. It becomes a natural way of operating. It becomes a pull situation from within the target area itself. Very difficult to do in that tyranny of the project cycle. And my next point is related to that. The contracts themselves, like the projects, are time limited. And so, you know, is there a mechanism in there to make sure that they continue? And my next point here is that the German phrase Realpolitik, in which the building of partnerships must be based on real world circumstances rather than theoretical and ideological constructs. So you need a high degree of built-in pragmatism, and to do this, I think you need some experience. It's very easy just to walk into a situation, but can be much harder to walk out. And I think the proponents of the contract process must be humble enough to recognise that they risk even destabilising long established informal balances. And we saw that in particular in one particular wetland in Italy, where there's a strong balance been established over centuries of peaceful coexistence. And coming in as a new player, you may actually disturb that. You're the new kids on the block, and you may actually create resentment. And I was amused by Giancarlo's reference to that there must be a problem. And I would point out that not all stakeholders will share the perception of that problem. The problem may be the result of the behaviour of those stakeholders who may view it as a financial opportunity, for example. My next point is the importance of the facilitator. Often just the individual, the person who's got the job, needs to be recognised. But the skills and scope of that individual should be articulated, and I'd like to see more reference to this. Who was doing it? What were their skills? What were their background? Partnership, community engagement, consensus building may be well beyond the comfort zone of the natural scientists, but they're the ones often given the job of driving these complex social process. You need some very specific skills for this, and as I found, a very thick skin. At the local level, for example, individual stakeholders are really rarely defined by their occupational or organizational label. They may be part of complex hidden webs of family, community and other local networks. And just an example, I remember working with a local harbour master who was also a member of the local golf club. His children went to the local school. So the last thing he wanted to do deep down in his soul was screw up the local environment. So everyone in your workshop has a history that you can't see, and they all know each other better than you do. And again, a small example, if I have time. Once, this was in Canada, I couldn't understand why shell fishermen in a bay were reluctant to challenge the quite severe agricultural runoff from the surrounding intensively farmed potato fields, until I discovered they were all descended from the very same small group of Scottish settlers, and they dealt with problems between themselves and actually came together to fight off outside interference. And so this is a bit like the observer effect, which is known from social and psychological research, which applies just as much to your workshops. So learn from projects outside the environmental field, particularly community projects. Right, am I up to speed? Yeah. Yeah, the last couple of points now. Leadership is key. And that leader may not be yourself. You may be, you may be a very bright PhD student or a site manager, but you may not be the best person to lead the whole exercise. It's always worth identifying community leaders who already command some respect in the local community and may be prepared to act as some form of figurehead. And this person may be a respected local political figure, a religious leader, or an important opinion former. One particular, my most successful experience back here in the UK, we persuaded the local admiral who was responsible for the naval port to act as a figurehead. And he came to meetings in full admiral's uniform, which was an amazing impact on the dynamics of the discussion. Indigenous knowledge, I think it's referred to, but it's something I feel strongly about. The value of indigenous knowledge is a little bit lost in the recommendations, but MedWet themselves have recognised that wetlands are inextricably linked with the cultural heritage of humanity and are a cradle for local knowledge of tradition, religious beliefs and aesthetic values. And there I'm quoting MedWet back to themselves. And added to that, there appears to be an assumption at times that stakeholders will somehow reach what is described as a higher level of knowledge through what would then be a one-way process rather than a genuine exchange of understanding, which has a little hint of scientific elitism. But as you recognise, particularly in relation to MPAs, we don't have all the knowledge, we don't have all the understanding. Remember that there's an old maxim, and you will all have heard this, that there are oceans of data, rivers of information, streams of knowledge, but only the odd drop of wisdom. And often that wisdom may actually be residing within the local community itself. And finally, the value of place. There is an understandable emphasis on understanding wetlands as, in conventional terms, as ecosystems, with perhaps insufficient thought given to their values as places. And so I'd really like to leave you on this point that these places, these wetlands, these MPAs, are places which have sustained communities for centuries. They've provided solace, silence, spiritual sustenance, inspiration, and even sport. So space needs to be given to those intangibles in the development of that all essential trust between all the players in the process in agreeing and, more importantly, delivering those contracts. So I'll leave it at that. That's probably a little bit of a storm of information, but now I think I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Brian. I guess we were we had a great opportunity in selecting you as a peer reviewer, because you have a solid experience in Mediterranean, but also you come from another culture, let's say. So your hints, I think, are very useful for us. And now we open the contributions, let's say, by anyone who want to intervene. I have some questions in the chat, but if there is any immediate reaction to the presentation and to the peer review made by Brian right now, who want to speak can open the mic and react immediately, let's say. If no, just to break the ice, I can ask pass to Giancarlo the two questions in the chat. The first one is about the application of the process you showcased in MPA, you know, where you have already a big master, let's say, the MPA managing authority, and already existing legal frameworks, now as the environmental plan, the regulation, etc. But I guess that in your two projects, you had already the chance not to develop wetland contracts with MPAs. So if you can tell us some experiences some lessons from these experiences, Giancarlo.
So if I quote well the point, the participant is wondering about how to implement this tool when you have or not have a managing authority. So different
when you have when there is already. I understand that the question when you have already a governance system in place, how this process process can embed in this.
Okay, so we have discussed this issue both in WETNET and TUNE UP, mainly in WETNET maybe. In any case, you can use this governance tool for achieving your management plan. So if there is an authority in charge of the management and the management plan still to be done, you can use the governance process for supporting the managing authority in coming to the plan. So the scale of the contract governance can somehow support, facilitate upper level. If you remember the piece of governance I was showing at the beginning. But at the same time, if the plan is there, is in place, and maybe there are some problems in implementing the decision of this plan, then the governance can facilitate this process. So it's something coming as again, as I told before, as a lubrificant, as a facilitator of decisions that are there, but not that have been taken, but that are not in place, still in place. The government might be different. This is clear. So it's not that any managing authority is equal to others, as both me and Brian have highlighted in different points. So according to the local and regional situation, you can have a different approach. We have MPAs in which the authority is just the director, for instance. So not technical and administrative staff supporting the authority. Or other situation in which the MPA is a full organized organization with even 50, 60 employees. And so you can count on different level of internal support. But this leads me to one of the improvement points that Brian was highlighting, and that I agree with firmly. That is the important to set since the very beginning as a recommendation, and when you design the governance process, which are the roles and which are the competencies that have to be put in place in order to implement the governance you are designing for your wetland or MPA. And in order to do this, you have to consider which is the structure of the existing organization that are on board, the promoter, the leader, or the expert that are joining the governance process, the participatory process, and try to add like a surgery, a surgery activity, the one that are missing and that are relevant for achieving the scope. So here the challenge is really beyond what we are usually used to think. It's not just a matter of having one architect, one engineer, one ecologist, and one biologist. It's not like that. It's the idea to have people skilled, trained and skilled in dealing with the complexity of that place. That is not the wetland, like Brian was highlighting, is the region, is the river basin, is the what we have called the interest area in both in WETNET and TUNE UP. That is the wider territory in which the wetland is, the MPA is, and in which the connection between actions and safety are in place. So you should be to really to design with a tailor-made approach the team that will lead the process. Again, I fully agree with Brian. Actually, this is something that we have not dealt with in our documents, and for sure this is an area of improvement.
Yeah.
And be brave. I mean, it's not just a matter of having that degree on board, you know what I mean? So not the engineer, the architect, but real competencies, because dealing with a certain group of interest with certain problems might require the combination of 2 or 3 skills that maybe are not in the same person, is in a team, in which you are able to move at different level, psychological, social, formational,
Thanks, Giancarlo. And I guess that speaking about roles, that is one key issue in this process. The matter is not only on persons, on experts, on doing this, on doing that, but roles of institutions. I mean, I guess that we must clarify since the beginning who is the body promoting the process, who is body facilitating the process, managing the process, and who must be the body or the bodies to implement the results of the process. No, because as you explained, a contract established an action plan, some activities to be implemented by several different organizations, of course. But in my one point could be who monitor, as you pointed out in the last part of your presentation, who monitor that everybody accomplish his tasks. So I guess that this geography of the different roles must be, it is a key point to be dealt with in the beginning of the process. Any reaction from the audience, or I have a look on the chat? For example, Sonsole is proposing a video where MBPC project tried to summarize some issues, on dealing with the wetlands and their values. I see another in the chat, another comment saying that a contract can be open-ended project, let's say, it can start as a project in the sense also, I think in the meaning also of having resources to start a process, such a process, because it is also costly, let's say, but can, of course, cannot close in a short term. And also Brian raised the point, what is the duration of the contract agreement? From your experience, Giancarlo, what is the better time frame for a contract life long?
I fully agree with Brian. You have to build a long-term perspective, a long-term vision, because the challenges we are facing when managing wetlands require time to be dealt with. Okay, so typically this vision should be provided by policies and plans within their own decision-making processes and their own participatory processes. When you come at the stage of the contract in which the purpose is more pragmatic, the question of the contract is, which is the first step we want to do together in order to achieve those long-term scopes and objectives. So the action plan typically has a duration of 3, maximum 5 years. That is the time you need for designing and implementing and achieving single actions. So the challenge, in my view, is not to extend contract to 20 or 30 years, to keep them simple, to keep them very pragmatic, but link strongly the contract with the plans and all the decision-making processes of the wetland, of the basin, of the place in which you are working. The French experience show us that a contract might be renewed many times. We have some river basin in which they have signed 4 times the contract. So first time signed, achieved, then a new contract, signed, and then achieved, and this for 20 years. This is an adaptive, approach that take into account the fact that boundary condition changes, that stakeholders changes, and even if they remain the same, they can change opinion, position, needs. So in your hand, you have this very flexible tool that along the time allow you to respond, to give an answer to the mutation of your environment, economical, social, and ecological environment, clearly. So different timing, the long-term one and the short-term one, giving to the contract a strategic vision to the long-term objectives, but then being pragmatic. Otherwise, we end up to agree in a dream plan, in which we put there all we want to do in the next 10, 20, or 30 years, and then nothing happens. So
yeah, very clear answer. So you mean the contract must not be seen as a strategy, but as a process where the main important thing is the actions to be implemented in a short term. And then if the mechanism works, of course it can be renovated, replicated, etc., etc. But the point is, I feel that the focus now is on the effectiveness, let's say, of this contract, not just as a framework.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other contribution, comment, whatever?
Luca, can I just come back on that point as well?
Yes,
if
please, Brian.
that's possible. Yeah, in the work that we did, and we would always differentiate between what we called core funding and program funding, so that we establish right from the start the core funding, which may be $120,000, 20,000 euros, pardon, 20,000 euros per annum, which funded a member of staff and some administration, which was funded by what we call the core partners, the environmental agencies, the regional and local authorities. So they had to put a relatively small amount each into this pot, but it meant that there was someone always there at the end of a phone, email, to help all the stakeholders and partners deliver that project, to feedback and monitor, and to report back on that project, on the program rather, the action program, and to start the process of reviewing and the equivalent of the contract as the timescale moved on. So there was always someone there, and every year we had to face a political fight to achieve that funding, but it was seen as totally separate from the wider action plan for the protected area or whatever. And that will depend to a large extent on scale. A small MPA, for example, it would be very difficult to justify that level of core funding. But it is quite important to have someone behind a desk or driving around the area who is seen as Miss MPA or Mr. MPA, who people then see as responsible for supporting their delivery of whatever the action program or contract is. I think one difference again between the French experience of river contracts is that, don't forget, they had behind them they had the big stick of the Water Framework Directive, which actually was very useful, because I've always found the carrot and stick approach, as we call it in English, quite useful to have someone be able to say, well, if you don't all agree this, someone will impose it through the Water Framework or Beach Directive or Urban Wastewater Directive or Habitats Directive. So it's useful to have that big stick behind, but you don't have quite that in the context of wetlands and MPAs. It's not quite so direct. Thank you. Thank you,
Brian. I would love to hear another voice than ours, because also I read the questions in the chat. So if any, also the ones that wrote in the chat, if they want to comment, to say if the answers were satisfactory or whatever. So I would love to hear other voices than ours. No, you were fully satisfied by the answers, by the comments. Okay, apparently yes. I don't see in the chat any other contribution. As I said, I will summarize I will prepare a report with the slides of Giancarlo and Brian, and with a few points on the last discussions. We had explanations on some specific points, and we'll spread it by next Monday. Just now to close this webinar, I can announce the next one. We are organizing in early 2021. We have not yet the confirmation by the lead partner if it will be in January or in February, but it will be on marine litter. So we have the Plastic Busters MPAs project still running, and they developed nice experiences in the field in this last summer, because of course in the summer 2020 was impossible. So they assured us that for January or February they have good lessons to present us, and we will disseminate the save the date as soon as they will confirm us the availability in what day, let's say. And the last point, today or on Monday, we will also spread this satisfaction survey for any of you that want to respond, in order to give us feedbacks on the model, on the model of this webinar, on the let's say satisfaction about the depth of the presentation, so whatever you want. I close thanking again Elodie from CPMR, of course, but especially Giancarlo and Brian. They gave their availability for this interesting webinar. And I don't know, Elodie, Hord, if you want to say something, or Sonsoles.
We're just thanking everyone for their attention, and also our speakers for the good inputs. And wondering if we want to take this family picture. So if we can ask the people connected maybe to turn on their cameras, so we can say hi.
If the attending people, yes, can turn on the camera. Wake up.
There we go. So there's the option also, I think, of the big gallery you can activate so we can see more people and then take the picture. It's nice to see you. You've been very quiet, but you are here.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Sonsoles, do you want to announce other events organized in the framework of the project?
It's not the end of this webinar. There'll be other series. We will be very active in the MPA forum that is going to be happening in Monaco at the end of November, beginning of December. Great opportunity to discuss this type of tools to protect our biodiversity at Mediterranean level, and hope to see you either there or any other common events that might be happening by the end of 2022. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you to all. Thank you, Brian
so
and
much.
Giancarlo.
Have a nice weekend.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye.